Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Russ. I'll start very briefly, and then I'll turn the voice over to Winona because my voice is pretty well gone from an allergy response a couple of days ago. But we want to talk about resilience and whole person balance because it really does make a huge difference. Quick introduction to myself, and then Winona will introduce herself. You all know me as a master herbalist and as doing herbal things. Our business really isn't just plant-based. We do whole person, heart, mind, body, and spirit. For 12 years, I taught whole person balance in the Franklin Covey, Stephen Covey books and so forth. And some of the material that you see here is based on some of what he called the 8 Habit book. So just to get that out front. I've studied nutrition my entire life, and I wouldn't have a funny throat today, but I have one allergy, sugar, and Winona was bottling grape juice. One of them didn't seal, and I said, let me just try it. Well, when you take 5 pounds of grapes and squeeze them down into 2 cups, that's way too much sugar to ingest. I had a stomach ache, couldn't sleep that night at all, and it left, for me, sugar leaves me with a almost completely blocked throat, sore throat, and I'm just recovering. So it's moving, but she's gonna have to talk because of that. And I was in the Air Force for 27 years, so the first story will be from that experience.
So, most of you already know that I'm a mental health counselor by profession, and just because of the nature, I think, of the society that we live in, I've ended up working with people with trauma for almost all of that time. And even before that, I was always really interested in trauma and how it affects people, partly because I had a kind of a traumatic childhood myself. Grew up in a family where there was some conflict and violence. And so I've always been kind of interested in how trauma affects people. And that's going to be a little bit of what we talk about tonight too, about kind of how that can impact our ability to handle situations in an emergency. So that's always been interesting to me. Fred, as he mentioned, and he put this thing in here about bias. I think he got that from somebody else who talked about their bias. So he wanted to make sure you get that he has a particular point of view and he has a particular way of looking at the world, so that you don't take that for anything other than it is. He's been interested in natural health for over 40 years. He tells the story, and he may have told it when he was giving his discussion of herbs and things. I wasn't here that night. I usually have clients on Thursday nights, so I'm not usually here, but he may have told a story of having a neighbor who was a midwife, and he signed up for the natural childbirth classes when he was 17 and a senior in high school, and was very interested in that. His mother was horrified and said, "You're not going to do that. You're 17." And he said, "Oh yeah, I am." And so she went with him to these natural childbirth classes when he was 17. So that was kind of his first introduction to the world of natural health. And he's been really interested in and reading books in pretty much omnivorously when it comes to natural health for over 40 years. He's been working for at least 25 years to help other people get better. He's had neighbors and friends and family members and so on, who even before he started doing it, as a profession, people have been calling on him and asking him for suggestions for help. And it's only, been in the last few years that we've actually been teaching classes and doing it professionally. But he's been helping people with their health for 25 years or more. He believes very much in the natural principles taught by God, and in fact, that's kind of always his criteria because there's so much information out there about health. His criteria always is, does this match what's in Scripture and what God has to say about the topic? And if it doesn't match, then he doesn't keep the book. He doesn't pay attention to it. If it matches, he includes it into his information. He believes very much in the balance of nature, that nature has a balance. And that's a piece of kind of the undergirding of this idea of us being balanced, you know, when it comes to emergencies and things that are happening in our world today. And his belief very much when it comes to how we eat, how we treat our bodies when we're sick, all the different pieces. If God made it, if it came from the way that God made the world, then sure, I'll use it. If it's something that's been processed and changed and not, if man created it, then no, he doesn't mess around with it. So that's Fred's bias. My training is a little different. I was a history student in my bachelor's degree, and what I was really got very fascinated with was American slavery, and particularly how did American slavery impact kids with the kind of trauma that they underwent. And it was a really interesting study for me. And what I learned a lot about is how the trauma really created difficulty for people creating and coping with the new world they found themselves in once the Civil War was over. And I kind of translated that into kind of looking at the world we live in now, and even us, how people who experience severe trauma and poverty and challenges in childhood often will have really extreme difficulty coping with any kind of stress or challenge in adult life, even though those experiences often cause them to actually bring a lot of stress and trauma into their own life, but they don't know how to handle it. And they end up sick. They have people with trauma in their history have an extremely high rate of every chronic disease you can name compared to the rest of the population: heart disease, cancer, diabetes, you know, every kind of thing you can think of, including accidental death and so on. It's much higher for people who have had a lot of serious trauma in their life. And so I was really interested in that and have been all my life. I have a master's degree in counseling, and that was sort of a God gift, I guess. When I was in my 40s, I was a single mom and working at a residential treatment center for kids, shuffling paperwork basically. And one day I remember saying out loud, wow, the therapists look like they're having a lot more fun than I am. I think that would be so cool to be a therapist. But of course, I was a single mom. I was in a financial position that I wasn't in thought of going back to school, and circumstances just kind of fell into my lap, and I ended up back in school and becoming a therapist. I also have a master herbalist degree, so I also have that same bias Fred has, which gets really interesting when I work with clients who are really mentally ill, because a lot of them are on medications, all kinds of different medications. So it gets real interesting because I'm also of the belief that our mental health is very manageable bias if we are willing to take the actions in our daily lives to take care of our bodies and our well-being. Our mental health follows that or goes with that.
Just one note on that one that you didn't mention, but why it's so important. The gut bacteria actually create 80% of our serotonin. So if the gut bacteria is not healthy, the mental health can't be healthy.
Right.
And our inflamed
The
gut
same with the dopamine.
equals inflamed brain.
Right. The same with the dopamine. Anxiety and depression both really strongly linked to that. Interestingly, back to the trauma thing, they've studied trauma and found that trauma survivors have a significantly different and less varied gut biota than people who have not had trauma. So these things all kind of work together. So that's kind of my bias and my perspective. I've worked with families in DCFS, so families that were being threatened with having their kids put in foster care and at risk of that. And then I've also worked with kids who are in the foster care system in the residential treatment centers. And so I've seen a lot of how trauma, again, kind of really impacts people's ability to cope with life and life stresses. And when we talk about preparedness, and I didn't put this story in the thing, but when we talk about preparedness for emergencies, one of the things that pops in my mind, and most of you here are old enough to remember the Carol Burnett show, and one of the stories one of the skits that kind of always pops into my mind when I think about how do we handle an emergency. There was a skit where they were doing a knockoff or a thing on Gone with the Wind, and Carol Burnett was playing Scarlett O'Hara, and she was wearing curtain rod gown, and she was all these things. Anyway, there came the scene where she's going to have a baby, and her sidekick Vicki Lawrence is the woman who was going to help her deliver the baby, and she starts, babies, I don't know nothing about delivering no babies, I don't know nothing about birthing no babies, and she's like completely hysterical, and Carol Burnett slaps her, and then Vicki, okay, now I can handle it, right? And that's a kind of a funny take on it, but I'm sure that all of us have seen or experienced people who in an emergency, they just completely fall apart, right? When there's a crisis at hand, when something happens, they completely come unglued and they can't handle it and they don't know what to do. And they actually get in the way of people who are trying to help, people who are there to respond and to provide support. And so it's really important for us to understand how to stay balanced so that we're not that person, so that when an emergency happens or when things get challenging, when the power goes out, when the water goes out, when our transit system breaks down, when we have to deal with all these things we've been talking about over the last several months, we're not the person having a meltdown. We're not the person who's an impediment to everyone else surviving and doing well. We're one of the helpers. So that's why this is such an important topic.
We're going to jump
our
to
standard,
this.
yes, our standard disclaimer. We're not doctors. We don't know what we're talking about. We can't give any advice. Just, okay. This is going to be harder for me to tell than Fred, because this is Fred's story. Fred was as he mentioned, in the Air Force for 27 years. And in 1990 to 91, he was in the Desert Storm, where they sent everybody over to Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and they were dealing with Saddam Hussein. And Fred's job was with communications, and they were in a bunker, and basically mostly underground. And they had 2 men to a room, so you were sharing.
Work was underground, sleeping was above ground.
Sleeping was above ground, but they had 2 men to a room. He was sleeping, he had a roommate by the name of Mike. Now, during this time, they were getting these Scud missiles coming in pretty much every night. It was pretty much a normal thing that you'd sleep for a few hours if you were lucky, and then a Scud missile would come. You'd have to, and of course, they thought that he was using chemical weapons. So if you can imagine, it's hot here tonight, imagine Saudi Arabia, in that same period. And I'm having to put on heavy equipment, like he has to put on the whole chem suit, the gas mask, and the whole hood. I mean, it's complete, and it's hot, and it's miserable, and it's really awful. And you have to go out of the above ground areas, go somewhere where there's no windows, and kind of just hunker down until the all clear sounds and everything's okay. You can come back out, and that can take anywhere from an hour to 3 or 4 hours. So, you never know what's going to happen. Then the next day you get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and you start your day, and you have to work all day. You don't get to make up for lost sleep. You just have to deal with it. And, next night, same thing all over again. So that was the kind of conditions that they were living in. So Mike and Fred were in the same situation, same circumstances, same kind of things going on. The difference was that when Fred got to Saudi Arabia, he was already in the habit of taking care of his spiritual health. He was doing daily prayer and making an effort to make sure he was connected to God. He was taking time to study the scriptures that he had with him and the things that he knew that he felt were important. He was taking time to make sure he exercised every day, even in those cramped circumstances, even something as small as, some jumping jacks and some running in place or whatever he could do just to make sure he was keeping his body exercised. At that time, he was trying to work on a bachelor's degree, and he was doing that with what they used to call what did they used to call it? Now they do it online, but you know, used to extension learning or whatever. But so he was doing that. And so he was making sure he was learning something new all the time. He was keeping his mind active and learning something new. The military, especially the Air Force, Fred always said he made the right choice in the Air Force or the military. If you have to be in the military, the Air Force is the right branch because they take really good care of their people. They made sure he had fresh food. The food in the canteen was high quality if you wanted it to be. I mean, there was always obviously choice for stuff that wasn't so healthy, but there was fresh food available and it was pretty good quality. And so he made sure he was eating the best quality food that he had available to him, making sure that he was getting as much good nutrition as he could. He made efforts to call or email his wife and kids often, so he's keeping those social and family connections going. He talks about how he would call home and talk to his wife sometimes for a couple of hours, you know, and connect with his kids during that time. He was fortunate that there were other people there who were Christians, who were of the same faith as him, and so he was taking time to connect with them and again help keep that spiritual life and that social life going. He was doing that on a regular basis as often as he could. Mike, on the other hand, was a pretty ordinary American Joe, and he was a pretty ordinary guy. He didn't really have a spiritual practice to speak of, and we see more and more of that in our world today. More people identify as no religion today than ever before in our history. So Mike was one of those. Mike liked what a lot of young people like. He liked scary movies, horror movies, you know, action movies, those kind of things. He kept close track of the news. You know, this was before 24-hour news feed, but he was still keeping pretty close tabs on the news and what was going on. He did his work, but when he got off work, he didn't want to do anything else. He didn't want to put the effort into learning something new. Just, you know, put on some movies or, you know, that kind of thing and relax and chill. And that was his way of handling. He liked junk food. And so even though this really great food was available in the canteen, he was doing hamburgers and French fries and pizza and, you know, the kind of food that's kind of the standard American kind of thing that young people like. And I guess probably not just young people. He wasn't married. He didn't have a girlfriend. He didn't have any other kind of relationships. He really didn't have any relationships with any of the other men in the unit. And so he was kind of a lonely, you know, single guy who really didn't have a lot of other connections. So both of them were tired. Both of them were working hard. The night came after they'd been there, how many months? Not a long time.
No, 2 or 3 months. 2 months, maybe 2.5.
So the night came that the same old happened. They're asleep, the scuds start, they're putting on their gear and hustling out into the hallway where there's no windows, where they can, you know, minimize the risk of getting hurt. And Mike broke down completely. Mike started screaming and crying, I'm gonna die, I can't handle this, you know, they're gonna kill us. I mean, he was just having a complete meltdown. He ended up having to be sent home, sent back stateside for mental health treatment and for some support. Fred, on the other hand, had an attitude, okay, this is hard and I don't like it necessarily, you know, getting woke up in the middle of the night, but I can handle it because I have that spiritual connection that tells me God's in charge and everything's going to be okay. And I have, you know, I know I've got a certain set of time before I go home. And in the meantime, I've got people here I can rely on. You know, and he also had, of course, he had his 4th child born like
27 hours.
27 the day after he got home. His wife gave birth to his 4th child. So he had a lot of good things going on in his life, so that when this happened to him, he didn't feel like he couldn't handle it. He knew that, you know, it was going to be okay, that he was going to be okay. So then recently, what was really interesting is as we were preparing this class, Mike reached out to Fred on Facebook and connected with Fred. Fred had
to give me some help on my business cards.
Yeah, Fred put it out there. I want somebody to help me redesign my business cards. So Mike reached out to Fred and gave him some input, and Mike and Fred were able to reconnect. So, you know, this is years later. Fred is 62. We're going to be 63 next month. And he is literally, despite his allergy tonight, he is literally healthier now than he was as a kid. He's happy. You guys all know him. He's happy. He loves life. He's a cheerful, positive person who sees life in a really good way. And he works hard to help other people get balanced and to stay balanced. And he often said he feels like a teenager. So I like that until the day he climbed up in a pecan tree thinking he was still 17 and fell out and broke 20 bones.
Nine,
Nine bones, nine. Okay, 20 feet, 9 bones. That's my bad. Yes. You know, so sometimes feeling like a teenager has its downside.
especially in a body that's this old.
Yes, yes, he may feel like a teenager, but his body is not. Mike, on the other hand, as they reconnected, turns out Mike has a lot of health problems. He's overweight. He has heart trouble. His knees are bad. He struggles with a lot of things in his life. He's a good man. He has a wife and children, and he's a good man, and you know, is helpful to other people. But he's got a lot of health challenges, and it kind of goes back to a lot of what I was talking about earlier. As we keep, you know, as we keep our ability to handle stress and trauma good, we're keeping our physical health good. Those things are really interrelated in a lot of ways. So, you know, I think about people who we look at, for example, one of the things that, and Maya, you kind of know this already, that statistically speaking, people who live long, who have the longest, healthiest lives are the people who are the most emotionally balanced and have good social connections and a good network and a good spiritual life and all of that. Even if you don't eat well, even if you, you know, even if you don't exercise all the time, and think of George Burns, right? The man smoked cigars incessantly. He did not eat well, and yet he lived a long, healthy, happy life because he had a good attitude about life. He had a good relationship with his wife, a good relationship with his family. He had just a really good outlook on life, and he lived to be 90 some years old, despite all of the health risks that he was engaged in. So there's a lot, you know, it's good to eat well. It's good to take care of yourself physically, but it's more important to do, and as important at least, to do these other things that help keep you balanced. So go for it. You can do these two because these are not mine.
Okay. Well, God gave each one of us a complete whole balance. We don't have to be glitzy like this slide shows, where there's lights and glitz going on, but we do have to be whole and balanced for us to be able to continue through this life. And so I'm just going to jump to the next slide and we continue.
Okay. The whole person concept one. Okay. So I love this idea. It shows this as a wheel. And I love this idea. And in fact, I was just explaining this to a client of mine before we came here tonight. If we think of these things as kind of a circle, these different parts of ourselves, we have our mind, that's, you know, our cognitive capacities, our learning, and our thought patterns. We have our body, you know, our physical wellness, our just overall, all the different pieces that are part of that. We have our heart, which is our emotional and social wellness, the part of us that connects to other people and the world around us and things around us. And at the hub of that, we have our spiritual wellness and our spiritual balance. And as we think of that as a wheel, if you kind of can imagine that if one part of this is not working really well, so for example, if you're really good at keeping active with your mind, you're doing things that are keeping your mind active, you're learning and growing, you have great relationships, your spiritual life is good, but you're not doing so good physically. You know, and as you go along life, things happen and your life is going along, and then all of a sudden you hit that flat part. You hit that part where your body needs to kind of help you through, and it's flat. And you can't keep rolling, and it takes a lot of effort, and you have to do a lot of things to just kind of keep going with your life. You know, or maybe you're really a health nut and you exercise like crazy and you eat perfect and you do all of that, and you're really smart and you're learning and growing that way, but you're not able to connect with other people very well, and you don't have good relationships, right? And you're going along and you hit this flat spot, and then you know, and that's just kind of why it's so important for us to have all of these parts working well. we can't ignore any one of them and say, well, you know, I'm okay over here, so I don't need to worry about that. We get
I have to talk about the hub of that, the spirit. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I managed to get a bicycle, which with 11 children, that was a rare treat. And my sister just a couple of weeks ago told me she was so frustrated because she never had a bicycle of her own. Well, I may have had a bicycle, but the rear wheel had a hub that wiggled the entire time. So I'd ride along and it'd go boom, 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 boom. But I could still move okay. I could never get very fast on it because it wiggled all the time. But I think it's appropriate to have that spirit hub, because if it's not tight and solid, everything around it wiggles.
right. Okay. Next slide. Okay, that's Fred's card.
Well, and I want to talk.
That, and
very
that's kind of,
briefly.
yeah, and that's kind of, and my logo has a similar center to it, that circle. And each one of those 4 parts represents a piece of us. And so that's, we're not here to shell our business, but that's, for both of us, that's a really important part of the work we do, is helping make sure that those, all 4 parts are getting addressed and all 4 parts are getting healthy. Same one again. Okay, so.
I must have dropped that. You don't, if you look beside you, you won't see any of the text on that.
Okay,
I-
so we've got to.
For those of you at home, no, I'll just talk about. For those of you at home, just grab a piece of paper and write heart, mind, body, and spirit 4 square on it. Kind of like this slide, so that you can make some notes as we're going.
Yep. We want you to kind of make some notes about some of the things you can do and some of the things that will help you make sure those parts are balanced, and that you're going to be able to keep those things. If you need something to write on, we've got clipboards and books up here. So we've kind of already mentioned, you know, all 4 of those need to be healthy for you to keep running and going faster. One of the principles that Fred learned in the Franklin Covey program, but it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, you know, the weakest link in the chain is where the breaking point is. So whichever one of these areas is the weakest for you is going to be the area where you're going to need to work and focus, because that's going to be the thing that's going to go flat and break down. So you kind of want to pay attention to wherever you notice that the weakest is. Keeping these things balanced requires daily effort. It's not something that we can just, you know, if we think about it, you know, it's not something that you can, when an emergency happens, that you can suddenly just find it, right? This is just like all the other preparedness principles we've talked about, you know, getting ready by having water and food storage, getting ready by having a backup plan for, you know, all the different areas of our things that we're doing. And I mean, we've had so many different classes, but all of them, you can't do it when the emergency happens. You have to have this stuff ready before the emergency gets here, you know. And I think about, for example, right now what we're seeing in the news in Haiti, right? They had this big earthquake. How many years ago there was the big earthquake that we all heard about? And what we heard is, oh, we're going to fix it. We're going to get better. We're going to come back better than we were. We're going to rebuild. But they didn't, and they didn't prepare. And so then when this earthquake happened, now they're, you know, they had so many people die in it, and they've had all these buildings collapse, and they're in a really bad place because they didn't do the work to be ready for the next one. And that's kind of what we need to really remember, is that this is not something you can do when the stress hits. You've got to be, you know, working on this now before it gets to a really difficult point. And staying balanced now, staying balanced in your life today is going to be a really important part. So let's talk about each one of those areas and kind of their purpose in our life. So for our body, Our body's focus or our body's energy and effort goes to just staying alive, right? Our body is all about making sure my heart keeps beating, I keep getting oxygen to the brain, and I keep going. And your body will do a lot of things to adapt to make sure that happens. It's astonishing to me how our body does things just to keep our heart beating and our oxygen to our brain. If we think about, for example, hypothermia, you know, your brain will pull blood and resources from your hands and your feet and your arms and legs to make sure that your heart gets what it needs and your brain keeps going so that you will live at the expense of maybe losing hands and feet to frostbite, right? Your body's purpose is to stay alive. Your mind's purpose, your mind's need, your mind's real need is to learn new things. It's really, if our mind is not getting stimulated, it literally will just, it can kill you. I mean, we think about people who are in, for example, who are put in prison in isolation. Why is that such a severe punishment? Because there's no stimulation to the brain. If we deprive the brain of stimulation long enough, we literally can put people into brain damage, you know, or even death. So our mind really has a need to learn. Our heart or our emotions, so not necessarily our physical heart, but our metaphorical heart, has to love, has to connect to people. That's also a life necessity. When, for example, we think about that, I think about the Romanian orphans back in the 90s. I've actually had some of those kids in treatment. These kids have serious, serious problems because they didn't get loved, they didn't receive that love, and now they don't know how to give that love, and they don't know how to connect to people. And they have a lot of problems, some of them. Babies die, we know that. I mean, that was one of the outcomes, is that those babies would die from not receiving the love that they need. And so it's really important for us to have that love, to give love and to receive love. And our spirit, you talk about that. You're much more the spiritual explainer. I know I work hard to keep my spiritual life in balance, but I think Fred is able to express that better than me.
We will actually see this on a later slide that goes deeper into it. But our spiritual need is to help others, to leave a legacy, to make a difference in other people's lives. And when we do that, it truly does make a difference for our own wellness.
In the mental health field, we call that self-actualization, you know, and it's kind of considered the pinnacle of wellness, and the pinnacle of well-being is getting that ability to contribute to others.
Slide.
Okay.
I can see that.
Oh. All right, this is going to be yours because this is the slide you made that I know nothing about.
Okay.
I assume this is the iceberg.
And I'm going to start with just one at a time. Our mind is all about visioning the future and trying to understand the future. Some words that might describe it are idealistic, achiever, strategic thinker, hopeful, thinking outside the box, or pioneering. A healthy mental state has a lot of stuff going on underneath that we don't truly understand unless we're working on it consistently. Our body is needing our discipline, our control of it. And it's realistic or focused or hardworking or committed, consistent, and taking initiative. Our heart is passion, optimistic, courageous, sensitive, affirming, fun, people-oriented. And our spirit is our conscience, our moral guide, our servant leadership, our abundance, our integrity, our ethical, respectful, fair. So we want to go through one of those at a time. And the invitation is, as we mention it, we'll mention some opportunities for growth. If you're weak in that area, identify one thing you can do to make a difference in that area.
So we're going to start with physical health, mainly because I think, for me anyway, I think physical health is the easiest one to kind of pin down some things we can do. And physical health things are often things that we can easily easily change, usually relatively easily. And the first one is getting appropriate sleep. If you're struggling with getting enough sleep on a consistent basis, you know, there's a lot of things you can do. I teach a lot of my clients something we call sleep hygiene, making sure that you have a routine around bedtime. You're turning off electronics a couple of hours before bed. You're not drinking stimulants or alcohol within a few hours of bedtime. You're making sure your sleeping area is quiet and soothing and not, distracting and loud, and temperature even can play a part in that. If your bedroom is too hot or too cold or whatever, that makes it difficult to sleep well. So you're going to want to have those things managed as well as you can, so you're getting appropriate sleep. Sleep needs vary from person to person, but generally speaking, anywhere between 7 and 9 hours is kind of the range that is within normal.
I was traveling one time, just had an opportunity to talk to the stewards. There's airlines and all that. Talking, I said, how in the world do you manage to sleep the night before you have a flight the next morning? She said, the number one thing is you never look at the clock. So if you look at the clock one time, you're done. So just turn the clock away, set your alarms as you need them.
That's great. Not looking at our clock if we're trying to go to sleep, or if we happen to wake up in the night, and I can vouch for that. I woke up last night sometime in the middle of the night and made the mistake of looking to see what time it was. And yes, I stayed awake for quite a long time after that, having trouble going back to sleep. So yeah, I think that's a valid principle. Don't look at the clock if you want to sleep well. Health and fitness goals. Determine some health and fitness goals and set those and focus on those. Don't be afraid to say, well, I want to be able to walk a mile. I want to be able to, I know people who set a goal even late in life. I want to run a 5K. I want to run a half marathon. I want to do some things like that. If we have a goal that we're working on, that's going to help us keep balanced physically, and it's going to help us stay moving forward with that. Fred already mentioned he has a bias toward, if God made it, it's good. If man made it, it's not. And I don't think there's any diet out there. I have dealt with weight issues all my life, and so I probably know every diet that there just about is. I've either tried it or read about it, right? One thing that I have seen in almost across the board is that there's an emphasis on eating food in its closest to its whole state as possible, right? I don't think you could find anywhere a nutritionist or a dietitian or a doctor who will say, sure, you should have donuts for breakfast every morning. Sure, skip breakfast and have coffee. Sure, just have, nothing at lunch except, a candy bar. Snickers, yeah, that fills you right up. Go for it. There's nobody that's going to tell you that that's a healthy way to eat. The way we want to eat is as much whole food, natural food, and nutritious food as much as possible. We want our food to be as good a quality as it can be, and the best way to do that is eating as close to natural as possible. If you have a garden, we live here. We've lived here in Diamond Valley for 5 years. We've all got these nice big lots. Grow a garden. If you've got the ability to do that, grow a garden. Eat as much of the vegetables and fruit out of your garden as you can. That's going to improve your health. So that's one really good way to to improve physical health. Include flexibility training, strength training, and endurance in your exercise routine. Things like yoga, things like just strength training, especially as we age. And there's a lot more of us in this room who are over 50 than there are who are under 50. And I will say that I have been doing some reading lately that suggests that strength training is one of the most important things we can do to maintain our bone health and our healthy longevity. I mean, all of us know and have seen people who are living in their 80s and 90s whose lives are horrible, right? They're having long life, but they're miserable because they've got all kinds of health problems. We had a friend in the last place that we moved who was a yoga instructor at 70, I think she was like 75. And she said that losing balance is the #1 cause of seniors having fractures, hip fractures and that kind of thing, because we don't keep our balance as we age. So strength training is really critical to us maintaining balance, in all kinds of ways. But, making sure that as we age and as we have to deal with things that come up, that again, we're not the impediment. Our body is healthy enough that we're not the ones having to be cared for and dealt with. We're able to be helpers. And reduce stress. Prioritize your life. Figure out what's most important to you. And figure out ways to let the rest go. There's a lot of different things you can do to help with that. And some of those actually come along as we get into the spiritual area.
So notice I've written something down I have to work on that. And that's the expectation, is that you'll probably find something that you need to write down that isn't your best in one of those areas.
Right. So improve some suggestions, and this is not by any means an exhaustive list, to improve your social and emotional balance. Value the differences in others. Recognize, that everyone is unique and different. It's actually one of the things that I love the most about my work, is the recognition that each person is so unique. And I love the way that Fred incorporates that in his work, that what works for me is not necessarily what's going to work for you. But that's a great thing. You have strengths that I don't have, and each one of us has things to bring to the table. And so valuing those differences. Forgiveness. We've actually been finding that this is a really incredibly powerful tool for social and emotional health. Is recognizing where we need to forgive and then making a conscious decision to do that, to forgive people.
Interestingly, all of the clients I have with significant health problems have to apply forgiveness.
They usually identify.
And I tell them, it's a choice. You can say, I choose to forgive so-and-so. And while we're there together, I say, are you ready? And they choose, usually crying, and let's go. And amazingly, we can move on to getting well. Right. With forgiveness.
And the interesting thing, that wheel shows these parts divided, but the reality is that these all are very interconnected and bleed over into each other. One of my favorite stories about forgiveness is Dr. John Christopher, who was a master herbalist that I was trained in his school of herbal approach, and Fred has read some of his books. But one of the stories that he tells, he was adopted as an infant, and he had a lot of health problems. He had serious rheumatoid arthritis. He had heart problems. He had all kinds of different things. And as an adult, he developed cancer, and he was really frustrated about that because he'd already changed his diet. He was doing all these things to be healthy, and he could not understand why he had cancer. And as he focused on it and meditated on it, he realized that he was really angry at his birth mother. He was really angry that she had abandoned him and put him up for adoption. He was angry that she had given him this heredity of poor health and all these health problems that he had. He was just really angry at her. and had never forgiven her. And so he went through the really challenging process of forgiving his birth mother. And when he went through that, when he got through that process, his cancer began to go into remission, and his cancer got better and went away. Because the cancer was kind of the physical manifestation of that anger and that lack of forgiveness. So even though this is something we do for our social and emotional health, it bleeds over into our physical health. And I've seen that, you know, and Maya, you may have seen that with clients too, that anger we hold on to becomes manifest in a lot of different areas. And forgiveness can be incredibly powerful for us, not necessarily for the person who's wronged us, but for us, it's really powerful. If you have family relationships that are not the best, work on building those family relationships. That is a really powerful way to improve our balance in our emotional area too. And this kind of goes back to the forgiveness piece, letting go of unhealthy competitive feelings or anger toward other people. You know, always feeling like we have to be the best or the first, or being angry at someone because they have something we don't have, or you know, and that can extend to our political views. It can extend to our, you know, just our religious views. There's all kinds of areas in this world that we tend to be angry at other people, and it really impacts us in ways that are not good. Making a date time with loved ones. I hope you wrote that one down.
I did. It's written down.
It's one we both have to work on. We both tend to get so busy that we forget to do that. You know, that's something that's really important for relationships, especially for our primary relationships. It's really important to take time and have downtime with each other. And then being really engaged is really critical. It's good for us. It's good for those that we're in our lives. You know, it's important for us to actually look at, listen to, and be involved with those around us, and not to check out. Those are only some of the things. And again, my guess is that all of you could probably add to this list ad infinitum of things you could do to improve your social and emotional balance. Mental balance. Man, we read about this all the time. How often do we see this, you know, on the internet or in other formats, or maybe even our doctors, you know, whatever, telling us, do crossword puzzles, do Sudoku, you know, read books that expand your knowledge area and experience. Maybe there's something that you've always wanted to know about and haven't. This says read a book. I'll throw out there, I love the internet. I absolutely love the internet. I can learn anything I want to know on the internet. And so one of the things that I love to do is when I'm doing some mindless task. So this last 2 weeks, I've been canning peaches. When I'm doing, you know, when I'm peeling peaches and pitting them and stuffing them in jars, I've got a YouTube video on that has, maybe it's something about medieval customs, or maybe it's something about something that happened in World War II, or maybe it's something about how to do some skill that I've been wanting to learn. You know, you can use YouTube, you can find anything on the internet. My dad, who's 88 years old and didn't get a cell phone until he was 85 and still only has a flip phone, won't touch a computer, but he loves the internet too, not because he ever uses it, but he can ask any of his kids a question, something he's wondered about. We can pull our phone and we can find the answer to that question, right? We have a library at our fingertips that is unmatched in the world's history. We have access to knowledge that is unbelievable. Use it, learn something new, you know, expand your mind and increase your knowledge base. Again, be one of those people that is a help in a challenging situation because, oh, I saw a YouTube video about that. I know how to do that, right? That can be you. That can be the person you are. And at the same time, you're a strength and you're able to stay balanced. Continue your education. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Camilla Kimball. So the Latter-day Saint Church a number of years ago. The leader of our church was Spencer W. Kimball. His wife was named Camilla. She was in her late 80s, I want to say, and she was still taking classes at BYU. Every semester she took at least one class till the end of her life, right? Continue, it never has to stop. As I said, even if you can't afford the time or the money to take classes, you know, at the university, there are tons of university classes online now. We're not limited to Dixie State or even SUU. We can take classes, some of them for free. There's a huge library of universities that offer online classes for free. So check those out and continue your education. I mentioned working puzzles. Yeah, you know, I love Irene Neighbor, who lives here in Diamond Valley, and she's always posting her latest jigsaw puzzle on our Facebook page. You know, she's always doing these really cool puzzles. You know, crossword puzzles, Sudoku puzzles. I'm trying to think of some of the other puzzles that we really like to do. But, you know, keep your mind active by doing puzzles. And then talk to people. You can learn something new from everyone you talk to. And I can look around this room and tell you that almost every single person in this room has taught me or Fred something new. I have learned something new from almost all of you that I spent any time with or talked to. And I can only actually see one person in this room that I don't know and that I haven't learned something from, right? Every single one of the rest of you has taught me something. That's a really important way to keep our mind active, is learning from other people. Other people have a lot of information because we've all had different experiences. To improve our spiritual balance. This is not our religious balance, okay? And I want to say that at the outset, because I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that spiritual and religious are the same thing. Sometimes they are. They're very intertwined. If you're a person whose religion is really important to you, that can be a huge piece of your spiritual balance. But as a therapist, I work with a lot of people who are not members of any religion. And we talk about how they can maintain their spiritual balance. It's a really critical piece. So getting into nature. A lot of people find a lot of spiritual connection when they're in nature. And we live in some of the most beautiful country in the world. Think about how many tourists come to southern Utah all the time just to look at what we live in. You know, when we were going in to work every single day, Fred and I would drive together. We had the same schedule. We would drive together, and we would comment over and over and over. We have the most beautiful commute on the planet. We just have the most beautiful place to live. When I lived in northern Utah, I used to love to go out into the mountains. You know, we can go up to Pine Valley, the pine trees, the Quakies, the fresh, beautiful air. You know, we live in an area that has some of the most beautiful nature there is. So get out into nature. Let your spirit connect with creation and the beauty that's there. Reading inspirational literature. So that can be all kinds. That can be religious literature that is uplifting. That can be maybe the biography of someone who is a very inspirational and uplifting and powerful person. And there's a lot of those in this world, and they're not all necessarily religious. You know, think of Gandhi, or think of, I don't know, there's just a lot of different people who have done a lot of wonderful things in this world to make the world a better place.
I've spent the last 6 months or more reading biographies and stories of women and their skills and talents and faith, and it's been just amazing.
Right.
Ancestors.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Ancestors.
Ancestors,
Yes.
yes. Reading about your ancestors and what they overcame and what they accomplished can be very powerful and very inspiring. I know Fred has been very inspired. I've been very inspired by some of Fred's ancestors and the challenges that they met in their lives. So yes, that's a great way. And again, use the internet. If you are not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint, go find familysearch.org, set up an account, and start finding out about your ancestors. that can be a real powerful way to connect spiritually. There's been a lot of studies done that find that as we get to see our own ancestors and what they overcame and what they dealt with, it gives us the courage and the capacity to cope with life better. And there's been some real important research done on that, and that's been backed up. Right. There is a healing that happens as we learn about our ancestors, a healing and a connection. One of the things that is really interesting to me is the study of epigenetics and how our ancestors' experiences literally come to us and turn on and turn off different parts of our DNA. And it's really amazing how that happens, and they've been able to find. And so learning about your ancestors can be emotionally healing, but it also can help you understand what's going on with your body, and physically healing. Like I said, these things are all so interrelated and interconnected, it's impossible to tease them apart completely. Think about your purpose in life. What gives your life meaning? What gives your life power? Having a life that's meaningful is probably one of the most frequent things that I have people come in to see me for therapy. They come in because they want to find out how to give their life meaning and purpose. And that's not 100% across the board, but that's a theme that I see often. And I would guess you do. Yeah, I would think that's true for you.
I seldom see that.
Oh, that's interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
I see it in probably 70 to 80% of mine. That once they clear everything out of the garbage is cleared
Oh,
out,
I see that. all
then
the time.
then they go, oh, I'm catching a vision of who I am, and now I can move forward.
Right, right.
Oh, okay, I get it.
And yeah, right. Or I get a lot of clients who are depressed and anxious, and some of the depression is I just feel like my life has no purpose. I just feel like I'm going nowhere. I'm not making a difference. And so, you know, that piece of creating meaning in our life is, I just lost, it's the last slide. Oh, good, I don't have to look. Okay, so you can talk about the music, inspirational music. Let's see if I can read that backwards.
Yeah, listen to uplifting music.
Uplifting music. It's astonishing to me how there's a lot of good music out there. I was really blessed. So I don't know about other people. I was really blessed that my father, when I was born, my father was not an educated man. He was not a sophisticated man, but he was in college when I was born. He had to take a class in music history as part of his generals. So he took this class on music history, and he came home and told his mother that his children were going to only listen to classical music. They were going to be exposed to this classical music. Well, I was the oldest, so I got it. Guess what? None of my siblings got that exposure or that thing. But from the day I was born, my parents had classical music playing all the time. I learned to absolutely love classical music. I still prefer it to any genre of music there is out there. I love classical music. We've found that kids develop their musical taste within the first 3 years of life. So whatever music you had your kids listen to or that you were playing when your kids were little, that's going to be kind of their preference for the rest of their life. But there's good music in almost all the genres. Find that music, listen to it. Music is a really great way to help your spiritual well-being and help you feel uplifted and positive when you're struggling. Commit to serve others. You know, again, I talked about people who come to me and say, I don't feel like my life has any meaning. Usually they want to find a way to serve others. And that's what they want. They want to feel like they're making a difference to other people in this world. I can look around this room. I see a lot of service. I see a lot of people who do give a lot of service and who have discovered that secret for themselves. That's a really powerful spiritual.
Worship of your choices.
Yes. And we mentioned that in the story about Fred being in Saudi, that, you know, one of the things that really helped keep him balanced was keeping his worship practices. You know, so if you do have a religious practice, keeping that going can be a real important connection and a real important way to keep your spiritual life balanced.
I hope that, like me, you wrote something down you can work on in each area the next step of this, if I were teaching Franklin Covey stuff, is you take those ideas and you set an appointment with yourself and you actually do that action sometime this week.
Let's break down how that's going to look for you. What is that going to look like for you?
Yeah, writing down an idea doesn't help us if we don't do something to put it into our calendar and make a difference with it. And I just want to talk about this last slide. The first one I showed with a guy in the middle of a bicycle was all glitzy and lots of lights and stuff. And this guy designed his own, hasn't got lights on it, but it's him in balance. And each one of us are going to be different. And we need to be unique on that. We don't have to have glitzy lights and so forth. We can be in balance based on our skills, our talents, and our balance. The critical thing is weekly action that keeps us in balance. And we know where we need the most work. By going back to what Winona said earlier, if we have an area in our life that we go clunk and it stops us from moving well, then that's the area we need to work on consistently to round ourselves out so that we don't get clunked right there. Questions? That's all of the presentation we brought. I have absolutely seen it make a difference in my life and in the hundreds of people I've taught similar processes to.
Right. Yes, forgiveness of ourselves is a really important part of being balanced. And again, that's something that can really slow us down. If we are having a lot of negative talk to ourselves, if we're telling ourselves negative things all the time, it's impossible to be balanced. It's really impossible. You can't serve and help and be a support to others if you're, really destroying yourself every day with the things you say to yourself and the things that you hold against yourself, not allowing yourself to let go of.
Thank you. This is going to get posted if you've got friends that are looking for it. It's on dvutah.wixsite.com/prep.
Yes. I love living in Diamond Valley. That has helped us stay really balanced. So it's one of the best things that ever happened to us. Again, I look around this room, I see a lot of people who have really contributed to us feeling like our life is more in balance. The other thing I think that I kind of want to mention too is that sometimes our life gets out of balance for a minute, and that's okay. It's kind of the overall picture we want to look at. I think about right now, my life has been really out of balance for the last 2 weeks. So I mentioned our peach tree went crazy this year. We probably harvested 200 pounds of peaches. We have given away peaches. We have done anything and everything we could think of with peaches. I have canned 60 quarts of peaches plain. I have frozen a whole bunch of peaches. I have made peach salsa, peach chutney, peach jam. I have literally spent the last 2 weeks almost every spare minute canning peaches. My life has not been in balance. It has been a real struggle. But overall, life is in balance, right? And that's kind of what matters. I think that we kind of need to recognize that sometimes our life can get, whacked out here because life happens. If we had an earthquake here, nobody's life would be in balance in that minute. But if we're balanced before that earthquake hits, we're going to be okay and we're going to come through it okay. And Maya, how often mental health counselors are being sent in to places where there's a crisis because people aren't in balance and they break down and they can't handle it, and it's just so important. The world is coming to pieces right now in a very real way. We see some really scary things, some things that are very concerning. if we're not in balance, it's going to be very difficult for us to keep moving forward. So I
Thank
guess
you
it's a
for
subject
coming.
I'm pretty passionate about.
And I'm very grateful that Winona had this evening free, because if it had been me, you would not have heard the same presentation at all. And she did a wonderful job, so thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's do it. Thank you.